we now move into our second technical presentation very quickly. Mr. Abhishek Tripathy will be presenting the latest research findings from their working paper on impact of financial inclusion on women's agency and household decision making. The session will be chaired by Dr. Vivek Pandey. Dr. Pandey is an associate professor at IRMA and the current chair of the Verghese Kurien Policy Lab at IRMA. Ms. Pallavi Madhok is joining us as the lead discussant over Zoom. She is the Director of Advisory Services with Women's World Banking. I request Professor Vivek Pandey and Abhishek to take their places on the dais.
Thanks, Trisha. Very excited to bring you this session on the impact of financial inclusion on female agency and downstream household benefits. I request Abhishek, he's a doctoral candidate in economics, to please present the findings from this research. Abhishek.
Okay, thank you, sir. And it's an honor to be presenting here in front of all those who are attending this workshop. So as you might have noted, in terms of the topic of this paper, which is impact of financial inclusion on women's agency and household decision making, this ties in very strongly with the overall theme of the workshop here, which basically says that we are trying to strengthen women's agency to power impact. And in this paper, we concern ourselves with the impact on their decision making and subsequent, downstream economic behavior. But what is the trigger of the impact? It is financial inclusion. So that is what we restrict ourselves to in the context of this paper. Okay. Now we began this work with the motivation, and we tried to ask ourselves the question as to why should financial inclusion matter for women. And there's a huge literature with respect to this. We'll come to this in a short while. But in short, in a nutshell, financial inclusion actually enables independent access to financial resources. And it can be a significant tool for strengthening agency, which is the power for women to take decisions on their own within the household. So this is in a household, within the household setup. Also, there's a big literature in terms of how they take decisions in the village setup, in terms of reservation of panchayats for female sarpanches, and there's a huge sort of academic inquiry going on there. Now, bank accounts in our case will be useful insofar as they really trigger this sort of agency. Otherwise, we would not be seeing any effect. And in subsequent slides, we'll be actually seeing how this effect transmits through different channels. So as I talked about the literature, there is a consistent link which has been shown between improvements in women's agency and household welfare in terms of increase in consumption expenditure, which is kind of what we talk about in this paper. Then there is also a change in the quality or pattern of consumption in terms of the nutritional, the distribution of whether the household opts for more nutritious food to be feeding to their children. So does that also get impacted through increased female agency? That has also been talked about. And at the same time, Nordman and Sharma have also talked about an improvement in access of public goods, so which is what we sort of tangentially referred to in the first paper also, in the first technical presentation. Now, there's a big line of literature which tries to model decision making within the household as a bargaining problem. So sort of bringing it as a game theoretic approach to this, and then they suggest that higher bargaining power of women improves their decision-making ability. And what are the different triggers of this improvement in bargaining power? So they are income share, there is asset ownership, and then there is decision-making on key assets. So in our case, we are concerned with whether financial inclusion for the women in the household improves their decision-making and improves their bargaining power within the household. Okay, in terms of the theory of change in a very broad sense, we have already seen something related to this in the first paper, but this is slightly different. I think our overall objective in this paper is to understand how consumption levels change in the household. And we are really concerned with the pathway that financial inclusion operates through by improving the decision-making power of the women. So that is the one specific pathway that we are really concerned with in this paper. So that is why Now I'll come to this in subsequent slides, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail. The way it has been arranged actually helps us in modeling this problem empirically. Okay, so obviously this is a massive exercise in terms of data requirements, and we require very similar to the first paper where we use the socioeconomic profile of rural India, the big data set, which we abbreviate as SEPRI, and it covers data on 93,000, close to 93,000 households across representative sample of different states across the country. So we really have a rich data set with information on household level, individual level, and even village level aspects, and the current situation that these households are situated in. So that way, this data is very well suited for this kind of analysis. And as per, I think Professor Das also mentioned in the first paper that this is one of those data sets which has data on income and expenditure also. So that way, this really lends itself to analysis of this kind. So I'll just run you through some brief summary statistics. So what we basically see in this table are just the results of a simple t-test. And we try to see whether different aspects of different household characteristics vary significantly, statistically significantly, based on whether the female has a bank account or does not have a bank account. So this is usually the first step that we take. And we really see significant variation, financial inclusion. If you look at the share of women in household decisions here in the bottom fifth point from the bottom, you can see that there is a very significant rise. So that's 0.7, the ratio. So 70% of the decisions in the household have women as decision makers. And in the absence of financial inclusion of women, it is 0.669. So and that difference is statistically significant. So which means in an experimental setup, this would be sort of a treatment. The financial inclusion for women would be the treatment. And this prima facie seems to be giving very strong variation in a positive direction, which is a very major empirical motivation for us to go further with our modeling process. Now, it would also, it warrants a little more attention to really understand what type of decisions. So we break down the share of household decisions into different, so these are the different types of decisions which are covered in the survey. So there are 26 different 26 questions asked to people in the to the respondents in the survey, and they really concern themselves about decisions on different aspects. So with respect to, say, whose decision is it to educate a female child? So does a female respondent say that yes, she's a decision maker, or does she say that no, I do not have much say about on this aspect in the household? So that sort of data has been presented here, and a simple t-test shows that there is very significant and positive variation across almost all of these, barring one or two, and especially with respect to decision to educate female child, which is quite highly significant, and as well as the type of school that the girl child in the household might attend. So the female in the household who has a bank account, she has a significant say in such kind of decisions. So this is what the table says. But this table at best tells us a correlation. So we cannot really, we can at best take this as an indication of variation. But if we have to really give some sort of causal interpretation to this, we need to model it appropriately. So which is what we'll move to next. Okay, so yeah, so this is, I'll just quickly run through the empirical specification. Now, the reason why our theory of change was organized in that manner, if we recall the diagram that we had seen, is because it really lends itself to helping us model this entire problem in 3 stages. So the last stage, obviously, where our main dependent variable is what is the level of consumption in the household, and that we model in equation 3, we will model that in terms of the share of decision making, in terms of the decision making power of the female within the household. So does she have a greater share of decision making power in the household? But obviously that is very highly endogenous in nature, and that's why we come to step number 2, which is basically where we model the share of decision making of women in the household based on the probability of them owning a bank account. So given the probability of them owning a bank account, that will influence the share of decision making of the women within the household, which is equation number 2. But well, the probability of owning a bank account is not random in nature, so that itself is endogenous, and that itself depends on a host of policy variables, which is what we try to do in equation number 1. So where we really model the probability of a woman owning a bank account in a household based on whether the village has a banking correspondent, what is the density of banks around that village, how far is the bank from that village, and what is the interest rate differentials, and the X vector basically is controls for a host of other village level characteristics. So in terms of now, if we move away from the mathematics here, and if we really try to see it with respect to the theory of change, the circled ones are what we are really concerned about. So stage one is basically how do policy enablers impact the likelihood of a woman owning a bank account, that is A. Given that, we then model how female financial inclusion improves the decision-making power within the household, that is the second circle, which is D. Given that, given the improvement in their decision-making power within the household, we then model what is the impact on consumption. So it happens in 3 clear stages. That is the empirical approach that we have taken in this paper. So this is just a description of the variables used. I would like to really dwell on the X vector in the second point, so which is a matrix of exogenous variables. It brings in, we control for a host of variables like dependency ratio within the household in terms of what share of the household members are less than 15 years old or more than 60 years old, essentially non-earning members. So that can also tell us about the situation of the household. In addition to that, we also control for the education level of the household, education level of the female within the household, and what is the female participation in labor markets and Narega. So do they engage themselves in the formal labor market or not? We sort of control for those things. Now the second point is the share of decisions. So this I have already mentioned. So we take this data from those 26 questions that we had asked in the survey, and we use that to create an index which moves between 0 and 1, and which basically says that a higher share means a higher bargaining power of the female in a theoretical sense. And if I might just dwell on the policy variables, so this is quite similar to how we had done in the first paper. So distance to bank basically measures the density of banks around the villages, and it should have a very significant impact on the probability of owning a bank account, because it induces some sort of transaction costs in going and accessing the bank account and engaging with the formal banking system. The last point is very important because we also have information from this survey. We know about the presence of a banking correspondent in the village. So the idea is that for villages that are very far flung and where banks, physical banks have not yet reached close to those villages, maybe banking correspondents can help and inform people within that village to really inform them about the benefits of engaging with the formal banking system, and that we hypothesize should also have a positive impact on the probability of owning a bank account. So these are the policy variables. Now, if I might just quickly jump into the results. So the first stage result, a very clear conclusion that we get is that the presence of a banking correspondent has a very positive impact. So this is what we expected. So a 1% increase in the number of banking correspondents is associated with a very significant close to 22% increase in the likelihood of a woman owning a bank account. So this is a very strong and statistically significant result as well. Another point that we noticed from this regression is that physical distance to bank matters. So in this regression, the farther the bank is away from the village, the lesser the probability of the woman owning a bank account. But we are also able to comment and say that for villages which are really far away from the nearest bank, the presence of a banking correspondent might sort of ameliorate the deficiencies which are present because of the lack of a physical access to a bank. So these two channels sort of work together and they kind of influence together, and that's why it's important to see these results in tandem and not in an isolated form. So both of them really influence the probability of a woman owning a bank account within a household. In terms of the second stage, we again find a positive impact. So there's a 1% increase in the probability of owning the bank account by women members will increase their share of participation by 0.34%. So, I mean, please remember that this share has been modeled as a 0 to 1 variable. So this 0.34 might not look very big, but actually in the context of the scale, this is a fairly big, statistically and economically, this is a fairly big impact. So thus we also are able to comment that women make decisions, how women make decisions is being influenced by the bank account ownership, and in turn by policy triggers, especially policy triggers like the interest rate differentials, which we have indirectly accounted for in the increase in decision making power of the females within the household. This is an indirect effect that we are able to comment on. Lastly, our results in the third stage say that, well, we have a very strong and consistent impact of financial inclusion on household welfare outcomes. So in a percentage term, if you're interested, 1% increase in the share of decisions, there is a 1.12% increase in the total monthly consumption. And now this is the causal estimate, because now we have moved away from the sort of correlation tables. So now we are able to really talk in a causal language and say that X has led to Y. So we are able to say that yes, female financial inclusion leads to higher consumption levels within the household. In rupee terms, this is a close to 2,000 rupee increase on average in per capita terms. So this is a very big amount. So this is in per capita terms. So if we take an average household size of say 5 people in rural, that is what the data suggests. This is a huge impact in terms of consumption. Similarly, this sort of consumption, so this is the total consumption, includes food and non-food. If we break this down, we see a big increase, close to 1,000 rupees increase in terms of food expenditure. If we break down that food expenditure further, we still find a positive impact on the expenditure on nutritious foods. And we have data available for that through our survey in terms of how much they spent on fruits, vegetables, milk products, and protein. So we still see a 472 rupee rise. And all of these rises are statistically, they are very highly significant at the 1% level. So overall, I think the overall sense that we get in terms of policy implications is that female financial inclusion does have a strong impact. So that is the question that we started off in the very first slide. Does it have an impact? Yes, we are able to comment it has a strong impact. And we also are able to say that this strong impact comes from the increase in decision-making power of the women in the household, because that is the channel that we explored in this paper. It is also important to recognize now that these outcomes are not happening in isolation, and the role of the local government in providing good governance around the village and really improving and sort of reducing the risk in the immediate socio-economic environment of the household is also very important. So that is what was referred to. That was one of the central points in the first technical presentation, where we really endogenized the role of governance of the village in terms of what sort of public goods are provided, how much money has been spent, public money has been spent. So that has a big influence on the sort of environment that is created for the households to operate in. So that we should not really lose track of that point even in the context of this presentation. In terms of policy implications for the regulators, it is very clear, and this is a standard result, that making bank accounts more accessible through density of bank branches is a very effective way of really improving women's financial inclusion. So this really ties on with the first stage result that we saw in the context of our paper. Now, given our assumption about the financial literacy of the account users, we do not have data available on financial literacy. So in that context, it would help to see these results as sort of a lower bound, because we assume that they know how to operate these accounts, and that therefore, if the regulator really engages in interventions which hope to increase financial literacy levels of the people involved, so so financial literacy will actually magnify the impacts. Hopefully they should magnify the impact. So that is another line of research that we will hope to work on with new data, which will have financial literacy information. In terms of and finally, in terms of takeaway for the stakeholders, I think it's important to recognize that if formal institutions are unable to resolve structural issues in terms of physical access to bank accounts, then micro interventions from fintech entrepreneurs can actually fill in that space, and which has actually been the theme of all our discussions and the panel discussions that have been happening that we have just attended. So there is a need for designing products such that they are accessible to women, and I think this ties in with the conclusion of the first paper also, in terms of what is the age band of the woman who gets financially included. That also matters. So for tech entrepreneurs who are attending this session, maybe they can really pay attention to how they design products that it suits the needs of a particular age band of the women residing in rural India. But overall, we can conclude and we can suggest that developments in technology and combined with entrepreneurial drive can actually strengthen financial inclusion in the villages, and this in turn, as we have seen, has impact on their sense of agency within the household, and this manifests itself in terms of greater consumption and greater food consumption, greater nutritious food consumption. So the effects, the welfare effects are very strong and very positive, is what we can conclude in an overall sense from this presentation. I hope I'm on time. Okay.
Right. So thank you, Abhishek. I think it's my turn next. And I want to thank specifically.
Ms. Pallavi.
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can? Okay, lovely. So I wanted to thank Abhishek. It was a fantastic presentation, and thank you CIIE and IIM for inviting me to this workshop. I'm frankly delighted to be here today because you've decided to put the spotlight on women and their impact on financial inclusion on households, and that's something that we've been trying to do for a very long time. And most importantly, very excited to see real evidence from the field, because we've done analysis in the past from other countries, but in India, we only had anecdotal evidences from the women we work with. So I definitely want to congratulate the IIM research teams, because you've brought in a lot of clear evidence. And on behalf of all the rural women in India, I think it's very exciting, and hopefully your study will inspire action from FSPs and policymakers. So I have a couple of comments that I wanted to share. The first one was on your primary input variable being account ownership of account, and I think this is something that a lot of people I think have already been speaking about across panels. Is that we seem to equate having a bank account with financial inclusion, and hopefully in your next rounds of data analysis, if you can also include some variables for account usage, because we all know that owning an account is not equivalent to using an account, and the link between agency and access is very weak. And in fact, in our theory of change at Women's World Banking, between access and agency, there are two very important steps. And one is that the woman needs to experience a change in knowledge, which is that financial awareness, attitudes, skills, and behavior comes with building financial capability. So just calling out the difference between literacy and capability here, and that's a very important step. And then of course with that comes usage, and then she has to sustain that behavior change, and only then does agency come about. So hopefully in your next data sets, if you can capture more variables around usage and on financial capability, that would be that. What you'll see is a much stronger, instead of 0.34, I believe you'll see a much stronger impact on her on consumption and on income levels compared to just owning an account. In fact, for policymakers, I wanted to call out, and I think you've not mentioned it, but in a way, a very important variable was when they enabled DBT or Manrega wages to come into her account. In the field, we see a significance difference in the way she may have owned the account, but then she started using the account. So, that change you will see when you look at it in the next time phase, I think post-2000, post-COVID, you'll see that difference in your data. So that's one thing I wanted to call about. Second is that, and this is something I really want to commend, you brought on the focus of the BC channel in your research. But we also know that some channels of financial inclusion are more important for women than others. So, and the BC channel is clearly the most important channel from proximity and because it's from the local community. And I'm glad your study recognizes it. And it's definitely more important than ATM and branches or mobile banking today. And so if you can also throw upon not only BCs as a consolidated unit, but women BCs or BC Sakhis separately. I know that a lot of your next study will be in villages in UP. So you will have data on whether these women have access to women BCs and BC Sakhis and the presence of SHG groups, because they have a significantly different impact on her financial capability building, usage, and therefore agency than just plain vanilla BCs. And the data that you throw out from there will really guide policy in the right direction to get more. We are really advocating for having more women BCs and BC Sakhis, but we do not have enough data to back that, because we believe it has strong impact, but our data is based on pilot, where I believe if you can throw out that data, it will be really useful for policymakers to start investing in more women BCs and women-led channels. And I think, very happy to see the results on consumption and welfare impact. And, this is something that we hope to use. And I hope to quote your study in a lot of the work that I'm doing. Maybe I have some more time and, we can throw the question more to the audience, but the implications that you raised for FSPs, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that, is that definitely they should design for products that help women increase financial inclusion, but focus more on usage. So focus more on how can I help women to save more in their accounts? How can we build more use cases for women to use their accounts? For example, UPI. There was some, we were advocating getting a UPI receive only handles, wherein, people can receive money in their Jan-Dhan accounts directly. And that's a very strong use case for them to start using their accounts. So how can we develop more of these use cases that can influence women is something I would really appeal to FSPs and the fintechs who are possibly listening to this. The second key takeaway for FSPs and policymakers is focus on building financial capability and not only literacy. And this happens at bank touch points. So BCs play a very important role in not only explaining products and services, but in closing the loop, in driving that sale, in ensuring she's building the capability of doing the transaction herself, ensuring that she actually does the savings or takes or does a renewal of the insurance. And then it genuinely builds her capability beyond literacy. So don't only provide a use case, also teach them how to use that use case. And then the women will join the dots, and they frankly, beyond that, they don't need much more assistance. They will take it ahead. And that's what we've seen in the field. And yeah, I think from a policymaker perspective, focus on ensuring DPTs go into bank accounts across states, not only central level DPTs, ensure there are more women BCs, because I believe you will see those results in women's agency, and hopefully provide data which is sex disaggregated on usage that Abhishek, you can then use in your further studies to strengthen your analysis. So that's it from me. Should we open it to further questions? Okay, so I think we have some questions in the group here.
Thank you for your comments. I think you just captured exactly the points that one was thinking about. Just one other thought, both for Abhishek and Pallavi, is how does one incorporate the fact that digital payment providers are also doing a lot. They're reaching into the interiors, and they and with all these Aadhaar enabled authentication, they can take out money. So you might not see action in the account, in the transaction account or the Jan-Dhan account, but the women could be doing things through the payment providers, and they are increasing their access. So how will you incorporate this going forward? Because that will be an important change as well. Thanks.
Yeah, so yeah, I think the data that we had that we used with respect to this is concerned with 2015. So that does not, we do not really capture information on digital payments. But the next round of surveys that we'll be launching, which Professor Das talked about, that has an exclusive section on the intensity, on the extent and the intensity of digital payment usage, and what sort of activities they are actually used for. Do you use that to buy milk or onions from the market, or do you really use that account to get remittances from someone who is migrated out and who is sending money to you regularly? So that sort of information is captured. So maybe in our further studies, we'll be able to throw light on the extent and the intensity of engagement and how that ties in with and isolating that from the engagement with really the physical banking channel, and how that has a separate impact on their consumption and household welfare. Yes, and that will form part of it. Yeah.
We have a question at the back. Yeah.
So my question is like, generally when you talk about the banking and you related it with the decision making, like generally banks are set up in a place where like people who are at least financially stable and all that stuff, even if it's in a rural area, like, but like I find that generally the bank is set up in a place where like people are somewhat financially stable. So did you did some defensive or something related that, and you analyze that, is that the bank like having a bank account of women is actually impacting the decision making? And the second is on consumption also. Like generally I like what I perceive is that the woman who is having a bank account like will have a very financially stable family also. So in that sense, like maybe the consumption level is actually like related to the stability of the family as compared to the not like the related to the bank account of a woman. So like I'm not much of like, I'm just in a first year, so I might be wrong in many senses because I'm just learning these things. But this is what I like there. So I think that defensive model will be more applicable here in some way, because I could not like directly like accept the conclusion based on the evidences, because did you studied something like initially there was no bank account and the decision making was less, but once the bank was set up and then the decision making increased because of the setting up of the bank? So my basic perception is like, my question is unrelated.
So I think your last point is with respect to, for example, the question of household doesn't have a female bank account holder. No, I understand, but no, that's fine. So, and then in that sort of a household, you increase the probability of a female owning a bank account. So that is correct. But for that, we'll really have to, actually, we'll have to sort of take it one step further and do some sort of sensitivity analysis and see that in the first stage equation for different levels of density of banks, how does the probability really change? And that we have already established the model of indirect impact of the density of banks on their decision making power. So some sort of sensitivity analysis there might help, which I agree. Now with respect to the question with respect to different diff is, I think some households really have they self-select into the probability of owning a bank account because the sort of conditions that they are in, because of the characteristics, as you said, they might be, by the way, one correction, it is not always correct that household that has a female bank account holder might be financially more stable. It might not always be true. Data actually suggests something else, because maybe people who work, women who work in the through the public works, Narega, they also get a bank account. So they might not really be doing financially well, but they have a bank account. So that might, so the data suggests otherwise. But in terms of the different diff, I think it's challenging because really we need to account for the propensity of each household to self-select into the possibility of owning a bank account. And that would really complicate the estimation strategy. Although I feel it can be sort of, we are actually looking at some sort of a propensity score matching in that case. That might help in this case.
Thank you. I'll take one question online from Niyati. So Niyati is asking that for the increase in the share of decision making, did you take every decision separately, or the ratio of average number of decisions taken by women to total number of decisions at household?
Yeah, we actually took the total overall all the 26 decisions. We have not explored it in terms of separate decisions, although it might really help to break down those 26, the set of those 26, and see which of these decisions relate to the girl child, the boy child, or in terms of the education or non-education and those sort of things. So these splits can be done, but in the context of this paper, so far this is just the overall share in decision making.
Thank you, Abhishek. I think for the want of time, we'd like to wrap up this session. I'll just take a couple of minutes. So going through the presentation, what appears is that, and what Pallavi also indicated, that there is a large gap between access and usage. And from that perspective, we need to contextualize this study a bit more carefully, in the sense that this is exposure study then. This is not a treatment effect. It's an exposure to a bank account, which is bringing down these kind of impacts. So if it's almost like a patient being exposed to doctor's advice, whether doctor accepts, the patient accepts the advice or not, is going to give you a treatment effect. whereas the advice itself will have its own impact. You are exposed to an advice, so you're exposed to an instrument, and you have certain type of downstream benefits. What is very significant here is that even the exposure to a very generic average type of product can lead to something so significant. And I think if you want to build upon that, it would also be interesting to see from the women agency side also, because we are focusing on the financial inclusion side, and yes, we have a multiplicity of the instruments, but it's also true that different types of instruments are going to trigger different aspects of women's agency. So certain type of products, let's say if I give the mother of the girl child the ability to buy stationery for the girl child, it might provide her certain transformative aspects of agency. Whereas if I create an app to manage the bookkeeping for SHGs, it may help the interloaning activities, and that may actually give you more active aspects of agency. So it's not just about the products, it's the mapping of the products with the various aspects of agency, which is very important. And to the extent we are able to design those products while understanding the needs of women, I think solutions of that type are not only going to be taken up, but also will get used, because value propositions are in place. If value propositions are not in place, we have to understand that both the benefits are known for ages. It's a 5,000-year-old story. People understand what is welfare. People understand how they can take decisions. Is the strengthening of the systems in between the value propositions that is going to connect the choices with the outcomes. Thank you so much. Very happy to be part of this.
Thank you.